This is our presentation on inmates with anxiety and or depression and their environmental and cultural factors. And it's by Brianna Dougal and Tara Womack. So the media often portrays mental illness as a joke when it comes to incarcerated adults. They are the funny, crazy person, when really they are sick. It is predicted that one half to one third of those in jail or in prison have mental illness and need assistance, but the media makes this difficult for people to understand. A great example would be the football player who committed suicide while in prison, Aaron Hernandez. His friends and family believed he was mentally ill and had deficits from too many head injuries, but the media portrayed his death as a way of getting out of being exposed as gay. The Marshall Project has an entire page dedicated to mentally ill incarcerated, where it links stories about those who have been treated poorly in the justice system for their mental illness. Because this population sees certain experiences differently, they can interpret someone bumping into them as asserting dominance rather than an accident, and this gets them into trouble. In reality, they just need help understanding social cues in order to prevent these errors from occurring. Those suffer from mental illness as a whole need support. Incarcerated adults are no exception. They need family support and encouragement from those around them. Family is often referred to anyone offering emotional, financial, or practical support. In some prison systems, there are support groups for those who want to discuss their mental illness. Jennifer Honig believes that if all prisons offered mental health support groups, there would be a great change in the stability of these patients. It has been observed in all levels of incarceration that people with mental illness were at an increased risk of victimization. They also had trouble adjusting to the institutional environment that often their psychiatric symptoms worsened because of this. Staff are being taught to understand that many inmates, especially those with mental illness, have histories of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse that led to distrust and a sense of worthlessness. It is explained how to stop this cycle by being respectful to inmates and teaching them what to expect when they are undergoing a new procedure. All examples shared was when correctional officer performed a pat down, they can explain beforehand what they will be doing to the inmate. This can help reduce anxiety in the inmate who may have experienced physical or sexual abuse. It is encouraged that inmates are informed at the time of booking about what they might experience psychologically once they are incarcerated and steps to take if they are having symptoms of anxiety, depression, or other types of mental illness. Staff can sometimes often offer resistance, saying it is not their job to make things easy for inmates, but staff is then educated on the safety aspect of why explaining things could be easier for everyone involved, and they usually come around. Many of those who enter the prison systems with mental health issues never get the medical treatment they need for their illness. Incarceration can oftentimes exacerbate their illness and in some cases make it worse. This can lead to and often does lead to recidivism within this population, causing a terrible cycle. More than one third of all prisoners were arrested within 5 years of being released, and more than half of those people are arrested and reconvicted within the first year. It is in the hopes of those fighting to get mental health care into the prison system that, with the proper medication and psychological training, the mentally ill population will break the cycle of reincarnation because they are now having the tools to help themselves. Unfortunately, there's still a long ways to go when it comes to mental health care in the prison systems here in the United States, but in recent years, it is at least getting talked about. There are multiple programs available, and these groups are working their way into more and more facilities. Heather Stringer's article is based on a psychologist from Texas Tech University. Robert Morgan, PhD, is testing a new prison-based program that helps inmates learn to avoid behaviors that may lead to reincarceration after they are released. Morgan's program, Changing Lives and Changing Outcomes, seeks to address antisocial thinking and behavior patterns, which he calls criminalness, among inmates who have been diagnosed with mental illness. Many prisons and jails outsource their mental health services. A 2017 study found that over half the states have privatized at least some of the prison and local jails. Another study estimated that about 70% of the incarceration system that are certified have privatized their medical services and mental health care. An example, in Massachusetts, the state correctional agency and multiple counties now contract with for-profit companies, including national entities, to provide their prisoners with mental health services. Only a few counties offer mental health services in-house or through contracts with local nonprofits. We have talked about these potential barriers a lot up to this point, but here you can see a list that is always growing on the depressed and anxious population is more vulnerable. It is where we look at social determinants of health. Social determinants of health are conditions in the environment where people spend their lives. Most of these places affect quality of life and health. There are 5 key areas that branch out into subtopics, and these areas are economic stability, education, social and community context, health and healthcare, and neighborhood. Prisoners with anxiety and depression specifically fit into 2 categories for their situation: social and community context and healthcare. Because they are incarcerated, they are more likely to be discriminated against. There is also a problem of limited healthcare when it comes to mental health. These are things that make the population more vulnerable. I think the best way to look at how prisoners are being treated around the world is to look at the prison systems themselves. Unfortunately, there isn't a ton of information about the treatments of those with anxiety and depression that are incarcerated, but we can look at the prison system around the world and see how the incarcerated humans are being treated as a whole. In the United States, we have a high conviction rate. Most prisoners reoffend, and their working environment is described as modern day slavery. Whereas in Mexico, their prisons are overcrowded, gang controlled, and murders are very common. In Iran, lawyers are often not available, the law isn't clear, and political prisoners have described suffering human rights abuses. The same goes for Russia. Norway and Sweden both focus on rehab over punishment. The inmates wear their own clothes and the reoffending rates are low. The Norway prison is an island prison that has no walls or jail bars, and inmates raise sheep and cultivate. In the Philippines, overcrowding is a severe problem and there's a long wait to trials. There are 3 things that make a major impact on the social economic status: unemployment, no high school diploma, and poor. This limits our population by not having access to proper mental health care, medication, and counseling once released. Not to mention, individuals in those 3 areas have a larger chance of developing depression and anxiety, which can be treated while incarcerated, but medication options are limited and there are 0 regular counseling options. Those incarcerated are more likely in a low socioeconomic status, which opens them up for several things such as drug abuse, sexual assault, domestic abuse, serious mental health conditions, poverty, and much more. African Americans are more likely to fall into lower socioeconomic status, giving them a higher chance of developing depression or anxiety. By also falling into the lower class, the likelihood of incarceration is high. Unfortunately, their access to good health care is limited due to financial status, which then leads to undiagnosed mental illnesses, which then leads to drug use and further incarceration. Whites and Caucasians have more access to health care and oftentimes fall more into a middle social class, yet they still have high rates of drug abuse and the highest suicide rate. They fall very close to African Americans when it comes to depression or anxiety, but have higher numbers when it comes to sticking to medication schedule and regular counseling treatments. Hispanic Americans fall short in almost all categories and are the least likely to have access to health care. The culture of Hispanic Americans plays a major role in them not reporting depression or anxiety. There are 3 main religious groups of the incarcerated population: Protestant, Catholic, and Muslim. There are 10 plus other religious groups that make a very small percent in each. There is little to no research on depression and anxiety of incarcerated adults with religious preferences. There is some research about being involved with a religion, but the benefits of depression and anxiety. Being a part of a community and group gives them the opportunity to express feelings and feel a sense of support from others. There has also been the opposite effect in the sense of feeling judgment or fear from God over feeling of self-harm. Women have a higher rate of depression and anxiety, but make up a much smaller number of those incarcerated. Women have a higher likelihood of disclosing their issues and seeking help. The numbers are still on the side of men side due to overwhelming differences in those incarcerated. Men have over 2 million more than women do, so the number of depression and anxiety in the system always show more with men than they do with women. Our group is not affected by this as much in the sense that they are incarcerated, talking about geographical location. Although there is a high chance our population came from a poverty-stricken area, which increases the chance of incarceration, depression, anxiety, and other psychological distress. Other areas of lower class encounter unhealthy living conditions, unfavorable areas near freeways, power plants, sewage plants, no access to regular health care, gangs and violence, and no safe areas for exercise. When it comes to bias, there are implicit and explicit health disparities. Implicit, they're dangerous due to their criminal past. They aren't mentally ill, they just use drugs, and they could get help if they wanted. You've never encountered them, but they are unconscious stereotypes. Explicit, you're not giving them treatment because you think they will take advantage of it, not putting any resources towards them because they are just going to end up back in jail, and they're all liars because all criminals are liars. Stigma is another barrier faced by low income communities. People suffering from anxiety and depression and co-occurring disorders in such communities not only experience the stigma surrounding mental health, but also that of living in poverty, which ultimately can lead to self-discrimination as well as lack of self-confidence. And then when it comes to the internal scope of the health disparities, there are regions of the world in which these disparities would have less influence on health or population. And the quick answer to this is no. Mental health is not treated in some countries. Mental health is treated very differently in less developed countries. On top of that, incarcerated adults are treated very poorly in other countries. Often they are placed in cells that are overcrowded and never full access for mental health conditions. There's little to no law in several countries about the treatment of mental health while incarcerated. American prisons and jail systems are at the top when it comes to depression and anxiety treatment. In fact, Cook County Jail in Chicago is considered the biggest mental health provider in America due to the mass quality of inmates and mental health conditions. And that is the end of our slide.